How Black the Sky by T.J. Marquis. Pierce only found out the name of the town as the three of them left it, travelling on foot to the west. It was imperfectly carved on a long wooden board suspended between two lampposts at the edge of town, and it was hard to read. He thought it said Nux. The road they walked cut through the land west of Nux like a novice surgeon's incision, winding slightly, taking random hitches around small outcroppings of stone. Otherwise, the land was mostly flat, and it was arid, dry and often barren. For 2 days of travel, they saw no one on the road, nor any farms or other towns. It was as if life had forsaken this lonely stretch of country. The crawling red sun seemed to grow and brighten when it passed overhead each afternoon. That would explain the aridness way out here. Decrepit old aqueducts stood dry and silent on the northern horizon. They may once have run all the way to the Wedge, a dense range of mountains perched on the edge of Overland, from which the waters of Flood Day erupted each year. Whatever kingdom had once flourished here, it was so far gone that it was no longer mentioned in children's textbooks, or spoken of in fireside tales. Pierce didn't even think the region had a name on the map. Pierce had never been great at occupying himself with his own thoughts, which was why he usually ran while travelling. He wasn't sure the others were up to that though. Certainly they were still mighty as ever, but he didn't think it polite to ask if they could move any faster. Pierce began to feel anxious, not nervous, but fidgety, despite being in motion. He was profoundly relieved when the road tapered out, giving way to a scrubby wilderness. They had to be getting somewhere now. Axborn called a stop, watching the land ahead for a sign. Lightning flashed in the sky over the barren fields. A strange figure made wild gestures in time, the earth shaking booms. "Fury! Bore into the earth!" he cried over and over. With each cry, a bolt of lightning ripped through the air and blasted apart a wide section of the dry ground, leaving behind dust and broken rock, some of it molten. Each time, the ground shook, and he relished the vibration in his bones. He didn't really need to yell at the lightning to make it strike, but something about the primal scream just made it all the more satisfying. "Rip! Shred! Blast!" he cried, letting fly arcs of electricity from the tips of his fingers. The heat of it sent a pleasant ache up the bones of his arms, and he grinned. Well, he was always grinning now, wasn't he? In a silent moment between blasts of lightning, he heard a familiar voice calling from a distance. "No," he muttered. "Go away!" He said it louder, craning his neck. "Go away!" He called another bolt of lightning down, and the earth at his back erupted in a shower of debris. "Just hear us out!" came a bellow from behind. What in the chasm was Axborn doing out here? "There's some stuff going down, Agrathor. Just calm down and listen. For old time's sake, if nothing else." Axborn was getting closer. If Agrathor kept summoning lightning, he might hurt the man and whoever was with him. He sighed. Well, he felt the feeling of sighing, and would have sighed if he still had lungs, or a mouth, or anything in between. Agrathor threw his spear to the ground and turned. Axborn approached, an amiable smile on his face. Scythia was with him, naturally, and a tall, heavily armoured youngster with bright eyes that flicked across everything he saw, rarely settling for long. The youngster noticed Agrathor and went wide-eyed. His hand went to his sword, and he snapped it free of the scabbard, eyeing his potential foe. Agrathor saw a portion of the blade revealed and staggered backward in an instant of primal fear. The kid had a bone melter. No, it couldn't be. Had Axborn come to end his misery? Had Agrathor done something that made him a threat to the retired members of Gorgonbane? Axborn put a hand over the kid's arm, whispered something in his ear, and the youngster's face softened, clicked his sword back into place. When he came near enough, the kid put out a hand in greeting. "Hello, I'm Pierce. My apologies, sir. I had no idea you were a skeleton," he said. Pierce thought Agrathor looked put off, but it was hard to tell since the man had no skin on his face. He was wearing armour though, obscuring his skeleton form in parts. That made him look a little more normal. "How did it happen, sir?" he asked. The bone man looked incredulous, his jaw agape. His eyes might have been wide if there were more than just green flames dancing in their dark sockets. Axborn grimaced. "Doesn't really like to talk about it, son." "No," Agrathor growled. "You don't like to talk about it. Every time I remember, I get angry, and when I'm angry, I feel something again. That doesn't mean I don't like to talk about it. Come on, ask again. I dare you." "Sorry, comrade," Axborn said. "Agrathor," said Scythia, stepping up and pulling the skeleton man into an awkward embrace. "It's been too long. You're looking well." "And you are as beautiful as always, Scythia," he replied, grinning. "Keeping this old joker in check?" Scythia smiled back. "For the most part," she said, "though he does misbehave from time to time." "So not much has changed," said Agrathor. "Actually, sir," Pierce cut in, "that's what we're here about. A lot of things are about to change, probably." "What's he talking about?" Agrathor asked. Pierce looked at Axborn for approval. "Go on and tell him, son," the man said. The short version." "Right," Pierce nodded. "Cash, the Underlord, is planning to invade Overland. He's going to attack Grondel, and we think because of the temple." "Infidel!" Agrathor howled to the sky. Pierce startled. The skeleton threw a gauntlet to the ground in a show of disgust. "Cash thinks to desecrate the holy temple of everlasting transcendence, does he? I will ruin him! I'll come up behind him in the dark of night, plunge the bones of my hand into the soft flesh of his side, and pull out his organs one by one. He made the motions with a bony hand as he growled. Pierce cut him off, having a thought. "Can you really sneak up on anyone, though? You creak when you move." Axborn made a pained face, put a hand to his temple in concern. "Grah!" Agrathor roared, and he struck Pierce in frustration. His hand drove into Pierce's breastplate like a battering ram, denting it. A shockwave of dust raced out from the crater. Pierce grunted and fell back a step, adopting a defensive stance. "Whoa, what did I do?" he asked, bewildered. Axborn's jaw dropped. That punch once killed a giant bloodhoof. Scythia looked surprised as well. Despite the gravity of the moment, Agrathor was still grinning. Pierce wondered if he would ever understand this man. Oh, it dawned on him. "You don't like talking about it, do you?" Agrathor growled again, but Scythia put a hand on his shoulder. "Peace, friend. The young man is not what we're used to working with. Try to have patience." The skeleton man backed off a few steps and stayed quiet. "That is why you came, though," he said. "Not just because you desire my might, but because you know my passion for the temple and for the way of the glorious paths." The green flames of his eyes dimmed a little. "You really are good friends." "More than friends," Axborn said. "Comrades." The two men clasped arms up to the elbows and gave each other a look of solidarity. "So first we defend Grendel," said Agrathor. "Then what? Obviously if Cash comes himself, we kill him. If not, do we go to the Underlands?" "It would be dangerous," Scythia said. "Especially if Cash's forces are mobilized. It's one thing for a lone warrior to go down and fish out a tribute, something else for an unorganized group to mount an attack. We cannot kill all the hordes of the Underlands on our own. Agrathor gave her a look that said he thought otherwise, but he did not argue. No, Scythia continued. Whatever comes after that, we will have to wait and see. For now, will you come with us? Your might is unparalleled. We cannot do this without you, Aggie. She said this earnestly, but glanced at the dent in Pierce's chest plate. Agrathor did not equivocate. I will come, he said. We will show the Underlanders what true might is. Lightning struck in the distance, throwing up dust and blue-white glare. So, said Pierce, I can't stand it, sir. I have to know. How did it happen? Pierce considered the black eye worth it. Agrathor had sucked him pretty good, but told him the story anyway. He'd had to know. It would have nagged him to the end of the adventure and beyond, assuming he lived. Pierce chuckled to himself, imagining the itch of mystery following him onto the glorious paths. The group had to travel a little way back toward Nux. Partway back, a branch in the road would send them in the general direction of Grondel, and Axborn had said they could find mounts at a town along the way called Siffa. They would have to circle to the far side of Grondel to search out Gorgonbane's fourth member, and head back west toward the Temple City. Then the race would be on, and with a glorious blessing, they would make it to Grondel on time. The town of Siffa was much cleaner and more orderly than Nux had been. Being from the far north, Pierce had never been to any of these places before, and was pleased to see that everything in central Overland wasn't all the same. Siffa was walled and gated, but the gates stood open on this fine day. The red sun was dim, leaving the land below cool, with a breeze coming in from the east. Axborn had said Siffa was known for its quality livestock, and Pierce began to smell some of it cooking. His mouth watered. They'd had only travel food since leaving Nux. The food there hadn't been that great either, and the last really good meat Pierce had eaten was the stolen heinous hog he'd cooked in the Underlands. The party was allowed through the gates by an older guard, who greeted Axborn with a salute. Pierce thought how good it must be to be known and trusted everywhere you went. Naturally, the party searched out Siffa's taverns first, to eat, drink, and settle into current events. They could also spread the news of impending doom. Axborn picked a little dive that had a homey feel to it, with a plump red-haired woman working the counter. The tavern's entire front was open. Accordion-style doors pulled to the sides to let the fresh air in and the smell of spicy foods out. "Oh, sugar!" Axborn called as he approached the woman. She looked up and a smile lit her face. "Axie!" She beamed and rushed around the counter to capture him in a great big hug. "What are you doing here?" She pulled her hands on either side of his head and inspected him thoroughly, pinching at his jowls. "I've been feeding him, sugar," said Scythia, smiling. "Don't worry." Satisfied, Sugar relinquished Axborn's face and stood back. "So?" she asked. "Well, we're on a bit of an errand," Axborn said. "More than that, I guess. Actually, if things don't go well, it may mean the end of Overland as we know it." Sugar made a concerned O face, but she didn't really seem worried to Pierce. "Well, we better feed you then. Come, bring your friends." She moved off toward an empty stretch of the bar and gestured the party onto their stools before resuming her station. "Hello, Aggie," she said in passing. "You're looking well." "Thanks, sugar," Agrathor grinned. "A mug of your mead'll grow the glow." Pierce started to imagine how that would work, how the bone man could eat or drink at all. but tossed the thought aside. Agrathor seemed to operate according to peculiar rules. "So who's that?" Pierce whispered to Scythia as they sat. "She seems nice." "Hence the name," Scythia said. "That's his sister." "Sugar?" Pierce asked. "Why Sugar?" Sugar heard from across the bar and said, "'Cause I didn't mean to be a warrior. No matter what our folks thought about it, imagine a respected brewer, innkeeper, and master baker named Spine Ripper." She shook her head comically in distaste. No, never. So brutal as he was." "Our folks were brutal," Axborn interjected. "Our pops always called our ma Sugar, so I stole the name." Sugar studied Pierce as he spoke. Well, my, you are a cute one," she said. "Think I'll serve you first." "Oh, well, thanks," Pierce said. "I'll have..." Axborn caught Pierce's eye. "You don't order from Sugar, son. She'll bring you the right thing. Just trust it." Axborn was right. So right, in fact, that Pierce kept on about it for the rest of the day. Sugar's mead was aromatic and sweet, living up to the name of its creator. For the entree, she brought out 4 spiced meat pies as wide as Pierce's hands put together. The crust was flaky, with a light dusting of powdered sugar, but the inside was salty and heavily spiced, with a peppery heat that begged Pierce to guzzle his mead to put out the fire. After several bites and sips, it felt like he was in a sparring match with the pie. With every mouthful came a fresh spike of hot pain, a wash of flavourful pleasure, and the sweet relief of cold mead on the abused tissues of his mouth. The pie mocked him, lashing his tongue. Pierce speared it again and again, jabbing the hog's meat that swam in its filling. Who would win, and who would succumb to the will of the other, yielding? Pierce sweated, stared down that final excruciating bite, and Axborn casually finished his meat pie and started asking Sugar about where to get a good mount nowadays. "Well," she said, "old Wolfrunner is still set up by the market. Good stock, but big prices." "As always," said Axborn. "What about Osterak?" Sugar shook her head. "No. He moved out to Grondel a couple of years ago. Took the whole family with him, and all those beautiful yellow-coated bloodhoofs. Hey, you might try Death Grips. She's new in town, but I've been hearing good things." "Death Grips," Agrathor said flatly. "Yep. Death Grips with a Z," he said again. "Yeah, hon, you got no ears," said Sugar. "Probably thinks the Z makes it sound cooler," Pierce said. He shrugged. "Kinda does." "Death Grips it is," said Axborn. "Bet it'll make Wolfrunner jealous if we see her first." He smirked. "You gonna finish that, kid?" Agrathor asked, waving a hand at Pierce's last bite of meat pie. Pierce belched a little and considered giving it to the Bone Man. Where had Agrathor's pie gone, anyway? "No, yes, sir, I've got to finish it." He looked up at Sugar. "It's delicious, Mum, just really hot. It's almost addictive." Sugar beamed and spun on her heel to grab a fresh pitcher of mead. "You can do it, boy," she said. "You keep burning that tongue, and you'll get numb to it like my little brother." Pierce took a deep breath and scarfed the last bite. He was so full that food and drink were piling up into his throat, but he'd jump into the chasm if that hadn't been the best pie of his life. Death Grips had replaced her hands with gem-powered mechanical ones that each sported a second opposable thumb and were symmetrical. Other than that, Pierce thought she was kind of cute. Her skin was pale and her dark hair was untamed. Her face was angular like Scythia's, but not as broad. and she had deep-set green eyes that seemed to be perpetually half-lidded. Her stables were clean and orderly, like the rest of Siffa, and she had several grooms bustling about to care for the various breeds of animals she had in stock. Her voice was lower than Pierce would have expected. "Gorgonbane +1, she said. "It's my lucky day." Her expression didn't indicate excitement, but neither did she sound sarcastic. "What are you in for?" "Something that won't try to chew on me," said Agrithor, grinning. Pierce blinked. Had Agrithor just joked about his ailment? He imagined the skeleton man socking himself in the face for it, and chuckled. "Shut your mouth, kid," Agrithor said. Pierce paid him no mind. "Nothing canine," Deathgrips said. "Got it. I reckon you'll all want an equal gallop, which means we need 4 of a similar stride and stamina. I think I can do that. How heavy are you, skeleton? The rest I can gauge." 350 pounds, said Agrithor, looking to one side. Deathgrips lifted one eyebrow a slight bit, but said nothing. She turned and gathered a few grooms to get on the hunt. 350? Pierce asked Agrithor. Scythia and Axborn looked surprised too. "Don't ask me," said Agrithor, shrugging. "Lost all the flesh, kept the mass. It never made sense to begin with what happened, so I don't bother to wonder anymore." "Fair enough," Pierce said. "Don't think I would either. So, where does your food—" Deathgrips had returned and said, "I'm recommending Raptorians for the boys, but you, lady, I think you can handle the blood hoof." Scythia looked flattered. "I'm not much of an equestrian, but—" "Well, it's not a horse," said Deathgrips flatly. "Anyone ever told you it was?" Her eyes flicked over to Wolfrunner's stables. They were lying. "Not a horse," said Agrithor. "Huh, I never knew. It's a good thing we came to you then, isn't it?" Pierce finally got it. Aggie thought the young woman was cute too. The skeleton was flirting. Axborn had adopted a shallow frown. "Now, I've ridden a bloodhoof before, you know. I think I can certainly—" Deathgrips shook her head, dark, wild hair flopping back and forth. "Not this one, man. He hates men." "What about skeletons?" Agrithor said. Pierce wanted to tell him to dial it back. Girls could always tell when you wanted their attention, and it always meant getting ignored instead. Right on cue, Deathgrips turned away again to speak with her grooms. They'd returned with the Raptorians, and Pierce chose his the second he saw it. Most Raptorians had unique scale patterns and colour palettes. The one that caught his eye had intertwining swirls of yellow and green down its back, like vines laced with candlelight. Her eyes were bright and alert, and her clawed toes were twitching with the readiness to gallop. "That one," Pierce said, pointing. "Please." Deathgrips looked at Axborn as if she knew he was paying, or maybe she thought he was Pierce's father, though their skin and hair were different colours. Axborn nodded. "She's yours," said Deathgrips. "You know how?" "I've ridden a few times, yeah," Pierce said. "Not afraid of falling." "Nah, she won't throw you. Might bite if you do something stupid, but they don't usually take off any limbs." She scanned him from top to bottom, sizing him up. "You'll be fine." "Now see here," came an agitated voice from behind the party. "I just don't believe it. You've come to this little girl before me. How many mounts have I sold to Gorgonbane, huh? How many?" "Enough to retire on, I'd wager," said Axborn. "And not one today," said Agrithor, sounding annoyed. His green eye flames flashed. Wolf Runner halted mid-step. He held up both hands. They only had 5 fingers each. "Not meaning to give offence, Sir Agrathor," Wolf Runner said. He turned his head toward Axeborn. "Just kind of thought we had a thing, a relationship, you know." The old stable master was wrinkle-faced and silver-haired, the top of his head mostly bald, hair grown long and tied back. His pale green eyes looked jealous. "Perhaps we were just giving someone else a turn," Scythia said. "Or maybe we just don't like you anymore," said Agrathor, stepping toward the man. Wolf Runner fell back a pace. "Agrathor," said Scythia. The skeleton man reversed his step. "Look, old man," said Deathgrips. "You ain't gonna beat my price, so you might as well just head on back to your stables. They may have meant to make you jealous by coming here first," she said knowingly, "but they didn't know I've got connections, and you don't." Wolf Runner scowled at her, then glanced at Agrathor, saw the flare in his eyes, and softened his face. "All right then," he said. "At least give me fair haggle. How much for this group?" All heads turned toward Deathgrips. 1,000 for each Raptorian. 3 for the Bloodhoof, she said casually. How do you... Wolf Runner stammered. "I can't beat it," he murmured, turning on his heel to slink away in defeat. I don't know how she does it," he muttered. Deathgrips finally smiled. A tiny thing that bent the corners of her mouth and squinched the ends of her eyes slightly. "I'm giving them to you at cost," she said conspiratorially. "Figure if Gorgonbane is out and about after all these years, must be something big going on." Axeborn pursed his lips, then tilted his head and looked appreciative. "You wouldn't be wrong, miss. We thank you." Deathgrips shrugged. "Saved one of my cousins once, you did. Gorgon, over in Eastfell River, turning everyone to stone. I wasn't alive yet, but Mum's told me all about it. You hear lots of stories about Gorgonbane, you know, if you're not in it." Pierce nodded. It was true. Axeborn paid the young woman and told her to drop by Sugar's for a free pie later. Meanwhile, the grooms brought out Scythia's Bloodhoof. Pierce had never seen one in person before. The creature had a lethal beauty, like no beast Pierce had ever seen. Its body was built somewhat like a large deer, coat a waxy yellow, with a fluffy white tail. Its head too was deer-like, but sat at the end of a long, sinuous neck with a white stripe down the spine. 2 small, sharp horns sat between its ears, and its hooves had a natural blood-splashed pattern on them, as its name advertised. Its eyes were bright and yellow, like Scythia's. "It's beautiful," Scythia told Deathgrips. "I don't think I've ever seen its equal." "Hard to part with too," said the stable master, "but worth it. With all you've done for the people of Overland, you deserve it." "You do us much honour," Scythia said with a small bow. "We won't forget it." The mounts were saddled and acquainted with their new masters, and the little party rode them back through town to stable them at Sugar's. Pierce was moon-watching late that evening when Sugar came out onto the veranda that wrapped around her tavern. "You the only one up, cutie pie?" she said. Pierce started out of his reverie. "Yes, Mum," he answered, glancing over with a smile. "At least out here." "Mum?" she mused. "I reckon it has come to that." Sugar joined him in looking up at the moon. "Ever wonder what keeps it up there?" she asked. "Kinda just figured it's sticky," Pierce said. "Crawls across the sky like a slug." But what would it stick to? Sugar asked quizzically. Pierce furrowed his brow at her. The ceiling? Seal, she said. Huh. Looks like just a bunch of open space to me. That's what teacher said anyhow, way back when. All blackness. Is that what they say in school? Pierce asked. Sugar laughed heartily. Well, yes. Didn't you go? For a while, Pierce said, but didn't offer more. S might know, said Sugar. I figure you're going to pick her up next. You should ask her for some lessons. Pierce perked up. S? The second? She would be the fourth member of Gorgonbane, the second most powerful mage in Overland. You think she'd teach me? Well, there won't be much time from the sound of things, said Sugar. But it can't hurt to ask. I'll send her one of my pies to butter her up for you. She winked. Pierce felt the urge to hug her. She was just that kind of person. Sugar beat him to it, stooping to embrace him where he reclined. She was soft and smelled of spices and sweets. You take care of my little brother now, okay? She spoke into his short, dark hair. Then she stood again. Her eyes were misty. Or it's poison in your pie next time, got it? Pierce smiled. Yes, Mum. The moment her old comrades decided to seek her out, she knew. They were as yet far away, so perhaps her long meditation would be complete before the time came to join them. She sat, legs folded, her body suspended above the dais at the zenith of her tower. Brackenverge's 8 spires looked down on her from even higher up, the wind whistling across their tips. Below, gigatoads sang their songs in the squalid marsh beyond the walls around the tower. She'd inherited Brackenverge from the first great master of convergent reality theory, back when he'd initially gained that title. It was a place to train, to experiment, to close oneself off from the distractions of the outside world, and perfect one's craft to the utmost. With such deep exploration, the first had achieved his mastery, and the second intended to do it as well. She took a moment to gauge the distance of her friend's intention signal. Yes, she should have more than enough time to complete her current exploration of the cosmic depths before she had to surface again. The second folded back into the chasm. She had to discover what the Underlord had learned. The towering keep that Scythia had called Brackenverge cast a long shadow over the hilly sward to the west, and Pierce followed the 3 legends along the shaded road leading to its gates. The tower had a great sense of age. Huge stone blocks, chipped and eroded, covered in moss with long fissures running up the tower's outer surface. Yet it seemed in no danger of collapse. In fact, it had a kind of healthy orange glow. Pierce thought it might be fun to climb. Pierce and the legends rode their mounts through the keep's open gates and down a long brick path up to the tower's great doors. They dismounted and looked up. The second to the first great master of convergent reality theory, or S, as Axborn had called her, was already on her way down from the top of the tower, gliding foot by foot through thin air. She wore fine robes of dusty magenta that drooped down over her hands and covered her feet. 7 orbs of ethereal liquid floated in a loose formation behind her head. Her face was obscured by shadow and the hood of her robe. "S!" Axborn called up to her. "It's like you knew we were coming!" "Always does," Agrathor said, grinning. At last S's feet touched the ground, and she strode forward to greet her old comrades. "Welcome back to Bracken Verge, dear friends," she said in a velvety voice. Immediately Pierce knew he was done for. He could listen to that voice all day long. He might not register the words, admittedly, but he could listen to it. "I see you've brought something of import with you." Pierce blushed and said, "Ma'am, I'm not that important, but thank you for saying." S turned her head toward him. "I meant the news you carry, young man. I can sense it, though I cannot read what it is." As she spoke, she lowered her hood, and Pierce knew he really was done for. S was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Actually, she was more a young woman, looking to be a few years his junior, but he knew that wasn't possible. Her features were soft and neo-tenuous, with large brown eyes and regal lips. Her skin was jet black, the area around her eyes painted white. He wanted to be a gentleman, but he couldn't help wondering what she'd look like in real women's clothes. That billowing robe was infuriatingly mysterious. S smirked playfully at Pierce and said, "Careful, child. If you let your eyes go too wide, they may fall out." "And then I'll start looking like Agrathor over here," Pierce commented absently, mesmerized by the fullness of S's lips. Agrathor began to growl lowly, but Axborn put a hand on his arm and said, "Peace, man. Can't you see he's lost his mind?" The skeleton man didn't respond, but he backed down. S chuckled melodiously at Pierce's thoughtless jibe, and he smiled like a dog given praise. "So, who is our newest member?" S asked. Axborn tilted his head to the side. Hadn't thought of it that way. He'd need to do the initiation." "Whoa," said Pierce, his attention finally pulled away from S. "I'm in Gorgonbane now. Why didn't you guys tell me?" "Hey, settle down, boy," said Agrathor. "We don't recruit without a vote. Not to mention you have to complete a mission. S knows that." "Let's hear it. I vote against." "Now, Agrathor," said Scythia smoothly. She didn't have to finish the rebuke. Agrathor clamped his jaw shut with a click. "I did assume," said S. "I am gathering that things are afoot that hold greater import than keeping to old traditions." "Indeed," said Scythia. "Pierce Boneswaddled has news of an invasion. Cash has found a way to circumvent the converges, it seems." "We're not clear on the details," said Axborn, "at all. But that's our best guess." "Hey, hold on," said Pierce, looking to Scythia. "You're giving me my title too? By the path, this is awesome! Though I'm not sure about Boneswaddled." "You'll take what you can get, boy," Agrathor chided, "and you're not a member yet." "Just trying it on for size," Scythia smiled. "Axborn and I had been discussing your great luck." "Luck?" said Pierce. He'd never considered himself so. He thought back to all the close calls he'd ever had, the insane situations he'd found himself in most recently. It felt like he was constantly in trouble. That didn't sound like good luck. "Yeah, no, I'm not lucky." "Friends," said S. "Please, let us focus and understand the plot that enshrouds us." "Yes, you're right," said Agrathor. "Forget about the kid." "If Cash can invade Overland by some means other than a convergence, we must not only defend it, we must also discover his knowledge and, moreover, the source of that knowledge," S said. "It seems to me that would be of far greater importance than merely foiling his plans. Come inside. You shall rest your feet. and we will put our heads together on this matter." An autonomous servant appeared, unbidden. It was a dusty humanoid of brass and stone, and its eyes shone with a dull orange light. Pierce wondered at it. You didn't see many automata around nowadays. Not since the disastrous defections in the Alban Wars. It silently took the reins of Gorgonbane's mounts and led the beasts off to the stables. Pierce patted his Raptorian affectionately on the snout as it left his side. S led her guests through the mighty doors of Brackenverge, which opened of their own volition at her approach. They were heavy doors too, made of plates of steel riveted together several feet thick. A giant could have fit through the entryway. Pierce went through last, and he jumped as the doors slammed shut behind him. He flashed back to the stomp jogging of the monstrosity. The tower's bottom floor was wide open, devoid of furniture. It might have been welcoming in a former age with benches and tables and vases of flowers. Now it was bare, damp with humidity, and lit by small orange gem lamps bolted to the stone walls. A narrow stair wound up around the inside of the wall, and everyone followed S up it. There was no guardrail, and the drop off the side of the stairs was sheer. Pierce supposed it didn't matter much to S since she could levitate. He'd always thought wizards' towers funny things. So much of their real estate seemed to be dedicated to looking imposing, looking forlorn and creepy, or just sitting empty, full of shadowy nooks where failed experiments could lurk. S likely had a favourite workshop or lab, and possibly an apartment for sleeping, unless she was one of those wizards who'd outgrown the need for physical implements or nuisances, like sleep. Indeed, she led her guests to a Spartan sitting room, adjoining a darkened laboratory full of the gleams of glass and the hazy glow of shaded gem lamps. "So, what have you been up to lately, S?" Axborn said as everyone took a seat. "We caught a really good job and were thinking we'd stay retired this time, before the kid here came crashing into Nux." "I've been blowing things up in the Baron Alzor," said Agrithor. "Feels nice. You wouldn't believe how resonant the ground is up there." "I'm glad you've all been well," said S. "Things have been quiet here too." Her liquid orbs swirled around to rearrange themselves as she sat in a high-backed wooden chair. "Mostly I've been working to master the 10th indispensable skill." "Ah," said Scythia. "Folding? Dangerous stuff, S." "Truly," S agreed. "Dangerous, but necessary. I have not grown so far to fizzle out on the 9th skill." "Dedication's always been your middle name," said Agrithor. "Wouldn't her middle name be—" Pierce held up his hands, thinking across the words to find the right one. "Master?" S chuckled again. Pierce guffawed. Axborn said, "The second to the first great." He trailed off and sighed. "The second is just her title, man." "I forsook my true name when I took the vows of study," S said to Pierce. "Axborn's tongue tires from repeating the whole thing, so he just likes to call me S." "S is prettier anyway," Pierce said. Agrithor rattled his armour against his ribcage and everyone looked at him. "People! The invasion!" "You never were one for pleasantries, were you, Agrithor?" S said. "We are men of action," he bellowed proudly. "And women!" "Well, Axborn is, and I know I am," said Pierce. "But how do you—" Scythia held up a hand to stop his chattering and leaned in to whisper. He meant we're men and women of action, Pierce. Not that you all like women. She dropped her voice further. Though he did once have a love. Surely that was before, Pierce began, not whispering back. Scythia put a hand over his mouth. Hold, man, she said. Unless you fancy another black eye. Pierce started, then held his tongue. She was right. He should think before thinking thoughts about Agrathor. The skeleton man did seem to have hang-ups. The conversation had gone on without them. Axborn had told S about the expected attack on Grondel. I can lay trap wards around the perimeter of the city wall, S said. Axborn, you should take command of the garrison. They may wish to resist at first, but when they see us all together again, I think they will submit. I don't fancy an altercation with Grondel's officers, S, Axborn said. But you're probably right. Things will go smoother if I can get direct control. I'll take the high ground, Agrathor said, and rain lightning down upon them until they're charred. He grinned. Can you cast beyond the city wall? S asked. It will do no good to defend the city if you burn it down. Agrathor shrugged, his bones creaking. I'll do my best. Range has been pretty good, but I'll admit I don't know specifically how big Grondel is. Scythia looked thoughtful. We are assuming a standard city siege, she said. But the strangeness of Cash's plan implies some new tactic. Cash may have flying cavalry we haven't yet seen, which would explain his sudden confidence. What if they came down from above? Or below, said Pierce. Agrathor scoffed. You been to Grondel, kid? Whole place is built on a granite mesa. Nobody's undermining that wall. Pierce didn't argue, but he had a feeling. They may have found a way to fold in, said Scythia, questioning S with her eyes. S considered this, but shook her head. I think not, she said. I would have seen others folding as I practiced it myself, and it's very unlikely Cash could train a significant portion of his forces to do it. Not in 1,000 years could he teach as many soldiers. No. I believe the 10th skill is safe from the hands of the common soldier. Scythia nodded, accepting her friend's assessment. Yet I have a strong intuition concerning this matter, she said. Her circlet gems were pulsing lightly again. They will try something new. What is folding? Pierce asked. Were you never educated, kid? Agrathor asked incredulously. Pierce shrugged. I had a couple of tutors back home, but they kept quitting because I wouldn't stay in one place long enough to have a lesson. I remember a few things about convergence theory, though. Never felt like I missed much. Huh! Said Agrathor. Too good for the glorious path, eh? No, sir, said Pierce. Just never thought simply knowing all the details was the important part. You get all stuck on that, you never feel anything, you stop trusting your instincts. Wisdom in this lad, Axborn beamed. It's just like I've always said, isn't it, darling? Axborn was never much of a scholar either, it's true, said Scythia. Prefer to learn by experience, Axborn said. Figure if the blacksmith put his mark on me, that's all I got to worry about. Exactly, sir, Pierce said. Trust him. He said he'd take us down the glorious paths. Nothing I can do would stop that anyhow. So, folding, S reminded everyone. Folding, Pierce. Might be better called pinching, or perhaps even tunneling. The skill is to bring two distant points of space together, as if you were folding a cloth, and then trade your current position for a new one. Pierce was quiet, taking that in. That's awesome, he exclaimed. Think what you could do in a fight. What she's done, Axborn said appreciatively. You do not want to meet this woman in battle. S remained humble, but said, It's quite an experience, Pierce. If you ever have the desire to trod the path this far, you will see. I mean, wow, he continued. I could fall down to the Underlands. S nodded. Or out past the chasm. Finally see what's there. Everyone shook their heads at this. No one makes it past the chasm, kid, said Agrithor. Pierce shrugged. Someone will. Maybe even S. S favoured him with a look. I appreciate your vote of confidence, she said, but not even the first has done this thing. It is said that the banshees can snatch a person, even as they fold. She shook her head. It is too dangerous to even try. Pierce remained dubious. I don't know about all that, he said. All I know is when there's something I'm reaching for, no matter how bad things get, I push through. And unlucky as I am, I haven't died yet. The others shared glances at this. Seems like Overland should think the same way. Everyone wants to know what's across the chasm, so why don't we just push till we find out? If that's what the blacksmith wants, we'll get there someday. Suppose that's true, said Agrithor thoughtfully. No one argued further, and conversation turned back to preparing for the attack. Pierce found it interesting that though S was clearly the most accomplished member of Gorgonbane, and though Axborn constantly sought his wife's opinion and approval on tactics and strategy, it was ultimately Axborn's satisfaction with the plan that brought matters to a conclusion. They would assume command of Grondel's forces and prepare for siege as well as they could. After the conference, the party split, and everyone was seen to their rooms. Pierce's dorm room was as Spartan as the rest of the tower. He lay back on a narrow bed, soaking in the faint light of a half-shaded gem lamp. His brain was wasting its time. Here they all were, on the verge of an invasion from the Underlands, and suddenly he was taken with a girl. Her face was already burned into his mind. He could trace its silhouette in the random shadows on the walls, in the natural grain of the tower's bricks. When he closed his eyes, S's white painted eyelids gleamed like beacons in the dark. He considered taking a stroll down the stairs, just in case she was out and about. Even one look. Fool, he thought. Why not just jump in the chasm? She might as well be the queen of Overland. Why would she want you? But she had smiled when he spoke, hadn't she? She had chuckled at his stupid joke about her middle name. What if there were more to that? Sure, he thought, and any minute now she'll just walk right in here and fall into your arms in her nightgown. Or just pants and a shirt. Yeah, something normal. His thoughts were running away with him, and he jumped when S did come by his open door. Pierce Boone, Swaddled, she said lightly from the hall. Come in, he said. What's going on, S? The wooden door creaked as it opened further, and Pierce sat up in his bed. S stood in his doorway. I was simply making the rounds, S said. I wanted to make sure everyone was comfortable. Hey, the shower was great. I think I've only ever had 1 or 2 hot ones. S laughed, like morning bird song. And you do get used to them, she said. I remember apprenticing in Grondel at the temple. They softened us up with cool air and hot water, then turned everything off 4 days before evaluations. Oh, that's cruel, Pierce said. Ingenious, S said. Those were some of the hottest days that year. You cannot even imagine the smell. Pierce made a show of sniffing his own armpit. I think I can. S wrinkled her nose playfully. Maybe you need to go back in for another wash. To this day, many of my old classmates think the first himself brightened the sun just to torture us. But it was a good lesson. The victor of the battle never counts on circumstances being ideal. Pierce saw visions of his latest escapades. That is very true, he said. Well, like I said, I just wanted to check in. My servant Rook will be wandering about, and I'll probably be up late night working, S said. So just let him know if you need something in the night. Pierce bounced his eyes off her lips. Did she notice? Thank you, he said. I think I'll be okay. S gave a nod and turned to float silently down the hall. What if I need you?